Hi everybody, this is Rick Kfoury with the Boston and Maine Railroad Historical Society. We're back here today for another remote presentation. If you're joining us for the first time, welcome. This has been kind of a weekly tradition for us here since we can't meet in person, so we're doing these to kind of make up for that right now. We've had quite a selection of presentations over the last few weeks, covering topics such as Dana Goodwin's color photography. We had a nice presentation on some urban shots in and around Boston. If you want to check out those older presentations, you can check them out here on our Facebook page or over on our YouTube channel. But today we have our first live presentation, so you're here with us live. We're here in Studio 2, our remote studio location, doing our presentation for you today. So if you want to interact throughout this presentation, if you have something to comment on or a question that you want to ask, you can drop a comment down below, and we'll see what we can do about it. Before we get started, I want to thank our online committee chairman, James Nixis. He put this presentation together, got all the technological aspects, put all the pictures in so you can see them in real time. So we appreciate his efforts for sure. So we're going to start off here talking about Manchester, New Hampshire. Some of you may be familiar with the book that the Society published about a year ago now, Queen City Rails, which I wrote for the Society about the railroad in and around Manchester from 1965 to 1990. Manchester is an interesting city. It's kind of a case study for what happened to the railroad industry in New England as a whole. It is the largest city population-wise in the northern three New England states. It was an absolute mecca in manufacturing and industry. It was said that it was probably one of, if not the busiest city on the Boston and Maine at certain points throughout its history. And within about a 25-year span from 1965 to 1990, most of that changed drastically forever. So Manchester is where I grew up. I grew up in and around Manchester in the suburbs, and I've always been fascinated with its history, and specifically its railroad history. And as a kid growing up with little railroad activity, I was born in 1995, so about 15 or so years after the real decline had started. There wasn't much left, so you would go around and you would see the trains that might be in once or twice a week, or you would go and look for remnants, and you would walk old rights of way and look at old artifacts and abandoned pieces of track and really try to piece together where all that came from. And the real reason for writing the book was a lot of the photographs that you'll see in this book, I had no idea any of them existed, and a lot of them had never been published before or seen by people in a large capacity before. So growing up as a kid, there wasn't a lot out there for Manchester, so you would see a location and you'd wonder what it looked like when the trains were running, but there was no photos to look at. So I wanted to kind of get some of those photos out there and share these discoveries that I made about what happened to the railroad in Manchester, and we're going to go through a little bit of that today in the presentation. So we're starting out here in 1980. This is July 28th, 1980. So about 15 years after our scope begins. But we're looking at a really fantastic shot of GP 38-2, number 207, heading northbound along Canal Street with local CO1. Now, CO1, by 1980, was a Concord-based local job, so they started up in Concord, New Hampshire, and they would come south and work the New Hampshire Mainline and some branch lines as well. It was the last local based out of Concord, New Hampshire for the Boston and Maine, and they would also serve the Goffstown branch. They would serve the Portsmouth branch at this point in time, and they would serve the Manchester and Lawrence branch. Now, for you not familiar with the Manchester area, maybe some of you from different places, Manchester was home to a main line which ran through from south to north, the New Hampshire Division Main Line, which originally ran all the way up through White River Junction, Vermont, and onwards towards Montreal. There were also three branch lines which fanned out from Manchester. There was the Goffstown branch, which was originally part of the North Ware branch, but by our point in time of history that we're talking about today, it was a dead-end branch which ended in Goffstown, thus the Goffstown branch. It's about 8 miles long. It left Manchester Yard, crossed the Merrimack River, and continued westward through West Manchester into the villages of Grasmere out towards Goffstown, terminated in downtown Goffstown. Then there was the Manchester and Lawrence branch, which was a through branch, which left Manchester Yard heading southeast down through towards the towns of Londonderry, Derry, Wyndham, and Salem before crossing the border into Massachusetts at Methuen and running into Lawrence. And then there was the Portsmouth branch, which ran eastward out of Manchester through East Manchester, along the shores of Lake Massabesic, into Candia, out into Auburn, Raymond, Epping, and then towards Newfields, where it crossed the western route of the Boston and Main, which runs up to Portland, and then continued on into Portsmouth, New Hampshire. So those are 3 branch lines leaving Manchester, in addition to the main line, which ran through downtown Manchester. So it was a very busy place. So here we have the local heading north. They've got quite a cut of cars, all kinds of freight cars heading up to Concord. So we're going to switch off to our next slide here. And you can see the train continuing on along Canal Street. Caboose C81 on the rear, a very typical International Steel Boston and Maine caboose, which they acquired in the mid-1950s. And interesting to see in this slide, if you look right alongside Canal Street, you can see a very low brick building. Now that's actually the site of Manchester Locomotive Works. So earlier on in the century, in the early 1900s and back into the late 1800s, Manchester actually was the site of manufacturing of locomotives all over the country. By this time, that industry had been shut down since the late 19-teens, so 1918, 1919, around there is when they ceased production at Manchester Locomotive Works. But it's very cool to see a train at this point in time passing that landmark for railroad manufacturing in Manchester. So we'll go on to our next slide here. And this is an interesting shot. These 3 shots that we've seen so far were taken by Richard Anderson. He was a freight agent in Manchester. He also served briefly as the freight agent in Goffstown. He also worked Ayr Tower, for those of you that are familiar with that part of the Boston and Maine. So he was very connected with the B&M in this part of the system. So here we have a northbound gravel train. This is an empty gravel train passing through Manchester Yard with 2 Alco RS3s, number 1510 and 1513. Now this shot was taken in July 1968. Those of you who are familiar with the Boston and Maine's history will remember that in 1968 there was a very large project to extend I-95, which was going on in Revere, Massachusetts. Now that project eventually fizzled out and died, but at this point in time they were running unit gravel trains from Bow, New Hampshire, down the New Hampshire route main line. Eventually they would go on to the Saugus branch and run out to Revere, Massachusetts. So it was a very interesting operation that was happening going through Manchester at this point in time. So we'll swap off to our next shot. We're looking here at Amoskeag. So Amoskeag is in North Manchester, which is looking southwards along the New Hampshire route main line, double-tracked at this point in time. And we have a Boston and Maine freight heading north. This is freight C9. So this is a Concord-based local job, which actually ran down to Manchester and then out the Portsmouth branch to Portsmouth. So C10 was the job that ran to Portsmouth. C9 was the return job. We're looking here at the return job behind GP7, number 1572. And behind that is number 1556. A really beautiful shot of those classic Jeep 7s running up the main line there at Amoskeag along what was then a double-tracked main line, but that would soon change in the mid-1970s. So we're going to head on here. Our next shot, we're looking in Manchester Yard, actually, and this is the same local. So we're looking at, this is local C10, which is about to head up the Portsmouth branch, behind an RS3, Alco RS3, number 1540. Behind that, there's a Jeep 7, number 1558. And then to the left, you can see an SW8 yard switcher, which is working the yard in Manchester. So a really neat shot here of the local freight, which is about to head out through the rural parts of eastern New Hampshire out towards Portsmouth. And that yard goat there, drilling cars in Manchester Yard. If you're familiar with Manchester Yard, the brick tower, which is still there today, is just to our left out of sight. That tower was built in conjunction with the CTC signaling up through the Northern Main Line and was still used to control that signaling out of Manchester Yard at this point in time. This is 1965. It's also used to control some of the switches in the yard as well. So we're going to head on to our next shot. We're here, a very famous landmark in Manchester, which actually still stands to this day. This is the bridge carrying the Goffstown branch over the Merrimack River. So we're looking upstream, we're looking towards downtown Manchester of a freight crossing the bridge. This is SW1, that's an EMD switcher series that the Boston and Maine owns several of. Number 1119 crossing the river with about 4 boxcars. Now, if you take a look at this train very closely, you can notice that there's no caboose on the rear. So this tells us that this is not going to Goffstown. This is a switcher with some freight cars for the West Side Spur. So the West Side Spur was a long stretch of track which started just west of the bridge here and then curved down along 293 and ran up through the West Side Mill Yard up to about where the Emmisgate Bridge is. So it was a freight spur, which served several customers on the west side of Manchester. So the fact that they don't have a caboose on here, which means they're not going out on the branch local to Goffstown, pretty much tells us that they're going to head up the west side spur. So a very neat shot. This bridge is still there, carries the rail trail over the river, which runs out to Goffstown. Very popular bridge for bikers and walkers. And the Goffstown branch was abandoned in 1981. So that's when the rails on this bridge became silent. So, going to move on here. We're moving to a shot taken on the west side spur. This is EMD SW8, number 801, which is working some of the industrial trackage on the west side of the Merrimack River in Manchester. This is doing the job that you would have seen the switcher from the previous shot doing eventually. So that trackage, when the Goffstown branch was abandoned in 1981, it also abandoned the access to the west side spur, so that trackage was abandoned as well. So continuing on the theme of the Goffstown branch here, we're going to move out to Goffstown, New Hampshire. We're here in Goffstown, January 28th, 1971. A cold day, and the local freight with GP7 number 1557 is doing some switching right off of Main Street in downtown Goffstown. They're switching out the industry there, which is Kendall Hadley Lumber on the left, a very big industry in Goffstown. If you take a look at this shot, you can just see on the right there's another track there. That track served Merrimack Farmers Exchange, which was another busy industry in Goffstown. Now originally, at this point in time, 1971, that siding on the right joined up with the track on the left just before the covered bridge in downtown Goffstown across the Piscataquag River. So that is just out of sight beyond the train in the distance. So we have the freight here looking towards Manchester, and they're doing their work in downtown Goffstown. Goffstown was an interesting place. It was relatively busy for freight. The branch would work it. The locals on the branch would work it usually twice a week. And they would go out there from Concord. Usually, it was usually a Concord-based local freight that would come down to Manchester and then run west on the branch out to Goffstown and work the customers out in Goffstown. Here we are, back in Goffstown again. So we're looking, once the photo changes here, at Union Street in Goffstown. So this is the local freight with 1557, and they're switching out New Hampshire Door. So New Hampshire Door was another important customer in Goffstown. It was located just east of the covered bridge. So here you're seeing the photo here of the GP7 switching out the covered bridge. Of the industry, rather, just east of the covered bridge. So we're going to move on to our next shot here. This shows looking westward in downtown Goffstown. So this is Kendall Hadley Lumber on the right, the large red wooden building. And then to the left, you can just barely see beyond the building in the foreground, Merrimack Farmers Exchange. And you can see on the right-hand track, there's a 40-foot B&M steel boxcar that is probably going to be spotted at some point at Merrimack Farmers Exchange, which received B&M 40-foot steel boxcars from Bow Junction. So the Blue Steel plant at Bow Junction today was once Merrimack Farmers Exchange, and they would ship boxcars of feed and associated supplies to different outlets throughout the Granite State, and Goffstown was one of those outlet locations. On to our next shot. We're going to stay in Goffstown for now. We're looking at blue-dipped GP7 number 1570 right in front of Kendall Hadley Lumber. You can see they're doing some switching because they have a boxcar in front. They've got a caboose behind and some more boxcars behind that. So they've got some switching to do there in downtown Goffstown, New Hampshire. Now, this photo was taken March 28, 1972. Still a good deal of snow on the ground at that point in time. And they have caboose number C104 on the local freight in addition to GP7 number 1570. Now, these photos we've taken in Goffstown were taken by Loring Lawrence. He is a native of Manchester. He was a rail fan, and he still is, and he sent us these photos, which didn't make it in quite quick enough to be in the book, but we're using them here today in our presentation. We're looking here westbound in Goffstown, New Hampshire, with GP7 number 1570, looking down the Merrimack Farmers Exchange track. And on the right-hand track, you can see the line of boxcars that they had brought into town. So there were a set of crossovers that they would use to do switching between the two tracks. There was a connection between these two tracks at the rear, looking westwards, and there was a crossover just ahead of the locomotive. So that's how they would run around their train in downtown Goffstown and do their switching for Merrimack Farmers Exchange. Next shot here, taken from within the landmark covered bridge there at Goffstown, looking back towards the Goffstown station, which of course at this point in time is not being used for passenger service. And you can see the GP7 there, 1570 in the distance, getting ready to head back east to Manchester. This is a neat shot because that covered bridge was probably one of the most important landmarks in Goffstown. It was a beloved spot for many people to congregate, and when it was burned up in August 1976, it was a huge loss for the town of Goffstown. And actually, the Boston and Maine decided not to replace the bridge when it burned in 1976. So they just established a new end of track just east of where the bridge once was. And those two customers, Kendall Hadley and Merrimack Farmers Exchange, were cut off from rail service. Now, they actually did receive rail service after that. They would get their cars just east of the covered bridge, and then they would truck the contents across the river to the businesses. But the rails were never relayed across the river. Another Loring Lawrence shot looking at the local. You can see the covered bridge here, and you can see 1570 with the local crew preparing to head out of town and cross the river back towards Manchester. Now this is a neat shot. The crew offered Loring a ride on the local, and of course he couldn't resist, so here he is in the cab of 1570 looking eastward through the covered bridge. You can actually see quite a few kids standing around on the covered bridge itself. It was used as a pedestrian walkway to cross the river in Goffstown, so it was not uncommon to see people in and around the bridge, even when the trains were in the area. It's been speculated that the bridge may have been burned by school kids. It's speculated it may have been burned by an arsonist that was known in the area. To this day, it's not officially known who burned the bridge in 1976, but it was burned nonetheless, and you can see a shot here about 4 years before 1976 when the covered bridge was burned. Continuing on here, we're going to follow the local eastward into the village of Grasmere, which is a part of Goffstown itself. In Grasmere, there was a county hospital, which later on became part of a prison complex there, but at this point in time it had not been constructed. So we're looking eastward at Grasmere across the field here, and you can see the county hospital there on the right. Now behind us, you can't see it, but there was a propane dealer, Home Gas, which received tanker cars of propane at that location, another busy customer for Goffstown. Eventually, the track conditions on the branch became so poor in the late 1970s that shipping of propane was no longer allowed on the branch. So that traffic ended. And towards the end, there were only one customer left in Goffstown. New Hampshire Doors was the last customer that would have received freight in 1980. And then once they closed, Kendall Hadley Lumber did receive some freight cars until the branch was abandoned. And here we are, the same local freight heading northbound in Manchester along Canal Street on the New Hampshire Mainline. This is March 28, 1972, so the same day as those shots we just saw in Goffstown. 1570 has 11 cars from Goffstown, so a pretty healthy sized train for the Goffstown branch. You can see one of those propane tankers from Grasmere towards the front end of the train. They're heading north to Concord, which is where this local was based out of. Note that the upper canal to the right has been filled in at this point in time. It was done a few years previous to prepare for the Mainline relocation, which was carried out 1974-75. So what they did basically was they downgraded the Mainline to one track and they moved it over to where the canal used to be on that filled-in spot there, and then they made Canal Street a two-lane road. So that was a pretty landmark urban redevelopment project in Manchester, which was carried out and eventually saw the Boston and Maine Main Line shrink down to one track through the city. We're going to head back to Goffstown briefly. We are here September 5th, 1974, so moving the clock ahead 2 years. Local Y6, which was based out of Concord and Manchester interchangeably, but at this point in time it was based out of Concord, crossing Main Street with freight. So you can see the town hall in the background there. Really neat shot of the trains when they were running in Goffstown, when the railroad was still an important part of Goffstown. Obviously, if you go to Goffstown today, that's all gone, and it's kind of hard to believe that GP9 diesels ran through the town. But this is kind of a snapshot of what that looked like when it was part of Goffstown's reality. Now we move ahead a few years here. We are here in West Manchester. We're looking at a GP9 heading out on the Goffstown branch. So this is in the village of West Manchester known as Squag, which is a colloquial name named after the Piscataquag River, which drains into the Merrimack River in West Manchester. So a GP9 heading out on the branch with 2 boxcars, no caboose, shot from one of the overpasses there at West Manchester, looking back towards downtown Manchester and the Merrimack River crossing. Now, Kelly's Falls in West Manchester was one of the most scenic spots on the Goffstown branch, probably in New Hampshire as a whole. This is the spot where the Goffstown branch crosses the Piscataquag River, heading westbound into Goffstown. We're taken from the Kelly Street Bridge here, looking towards the branch. Now, this shot was taken July 14th, 1980, so there's actually only a few more months of service left on the Goffstown branch. The last train to run the Goffstown branch did so in September 1980. At that point in time, they were only serving Kendall Hadley lumber. So you can see one boxcar in the consist here. Kind of shows that traffic was dropping down. The Goffstown branch was formally abandoned in 1981, as we said before. And a really, really cool shot. This comes out of Mike Lennon's collection. Looking westbound, this is the freight with 1557 just crossing Union Street in Goffstown. You can see the New Hampshire Doors building in the background. That was closed by 1980, so they were no longer a rail customer. They have one former Rock Island boxcar, which was purchased by the Boston and Maine when the Rock Island was bankrupted in 1980. That is an empty car from Kendall Hadley Lumber. This is not dated, but this is 1980. And we do know that 1557 ran the last freight on the Goffstown branch in September 1980, so this very well could be that last train on the Goffstown branch. Now we're going to head back to Manchester. We're all set with the Goffstown branch for now. We are looking at a local freight heading north along Canal Street there in Manchester. This is September 1979. GP38-2, number 210, is northbound for Concord. They've got a very healthy cut of cars behind their train. Very classic shot of the local heading through the mill yard here in Manchester. Looks relatively similar today. There's that one track which is still there, the main line. Obviously there's some landmarks here that are slightly altered, but this is a pretty trademark shot of rail service in Manchester. Now we'll head back to Manchester Yard. Now, Manchester Yard was a pretty healthy sized plot of land just south of Granite Street in Manchester. There were actually 2 yards in Manchester Yard. There was the Woods Yard, which was on the left-hand or the west-hand side of the yard. Then there was the Ledges Yard, which was on the right-hand or the eastern side of Manchester Yard. 2 freight yards in Manchester, and then passing through them was the New Hampshire route Mainline. So we're here at the engine facility track in Manchester, which is right about where the outfield is today at the Fisher Cats ballpark. SW8 number 806 is sitting here. This is March 20th, 1982. So Manchester was home to a little bit over 100 industrial customers. So anything you can think of was shipped in or out of Manchester. Newsprint, newspapers, there was a meat packaging plant, paper companies, lumber companies, you name it. It saw freight service in Manchester. So owing to that, they had several trick switcher jobs, which would handle the freight customers in Manchester. So the EMD SW8, you can see here, was a very common model of switcher that would be used in Manchester. The crews really liked it because it had a very good tractive effort. It was able to pull pretty steadily along different grades of track, long cuts of cars. So here they are. This is 806, which would have been used probably on the Manchester and Lawrence branch from Manchester down to Manchester Airport, which is usually where they use the SW8s. They also used them out through East Manchester on the Manchester and Portsmouth branch. The customers on the Portsmouth branch from Manchester Yard out to Page Street in Manchester were the domain of the switcher crews. And then all the customers further east from Page Street were handled by the local freights which ran the branch. So this may have been used either on the Portsmouth branch, the Manchester and Lawrence branch were both very likely. Another model of switcher that was very popular in Manchester was the EMD SW1. A smaller switcher had a smaller wheelbase, which was able to navigate the very numerous industrial sidings in Manchester. There were sidings that ran through parking lots, there were sidings that ran through streets, and there were sidings that went up steep grades and around sharp curves. So this switcher was able to get in and out of all those industrial customers. It had a pretty good track effort, so it was able to pull pretty suitably. So these were suited by the Manchester switcher crews, the SW1s. This particular engine here, number 1123, is in a pretty faded version of the maroon and gold paint scheme, which it was delivered into the Boston and Maine. That tells us that it's probably a pretty good runner, because faded locomotives usually didn't get new paint schemes unless they had to go to the repair shop. And if they didn't have to go to the repair shop, then they usually didn't get painted. So this 1123 was a very good runner for the Boston and Maine. We're here in Manchester Yard again, and we see 1733, which is an EMD GP9, in its classic McGuinness Bluebird paint scheme. That was its delivery paint scheme. This was actually the very last GP9 to survive wearing that Bluebird paint scheme into the early 1980s. These were delivered to the Boston and Maine in 1957. To the right, you can see a remnant of the original Roundhouse complex in Manchester. The Roundhouse stood just about where the Fisher Cats ballpark is, and was torn down in the late 50s, early 60s, but small parts of it were kept to store locomotive sand, to store other equipment needed by the locomotive crews in Manchester, and also parts of it were leased out to companies for various things. There was a scrap dealer that operated out of part of the former Roundhouse in Manchester Yard, so you can see a remnant of that brick Roundhouse there. This train has one Burlington Northern boxcar and a caboose, so this probably just came back from New Hampshire doors in Goffstown. This looks like it's the Goffstown local coming back into Manchester Yard. Now, another branch that was served out of Manchester that we mentioned was the Manchester and Lawrence branch, which was a lengthy branch which ran between those two cities. The branch from Manchester Yard down to about where the 293 overpasses in South Manchester are today was served by a Manchester switcher, and then all of the industries from Manchester Airport to Lawrence were handled by a local freight which came up from Lawrence. That changed in 1976 or so, about there, when Manchester switching lanes were extended from Manchester Yard to Londonderry. So now a local freight only had to go up as far as Derry, New Hampshire, and the customers from Manchester to Londonderry could be handled by a switcher out of Manchester Yard. It was just easier to do that. That way a local didn't have to run all the way up from Lawrence. The track wasn't that great at that point in time, so it was easier for a switcher out of Manchester to handle it. But we're here in Derry, New Hampshire, right by the station in Derry, which at that point in time was privately owned. This is an SW8 switcher, and they are doing some work there with a transfer caboose, and they've just come up from Lawrence. So this is the local freight coming into Derry from Lawrence, Massachusetts. Another switcher that was relatively common in Manchester was the EMD NW2. This was an earlier switcher constructed in the late 1930s, early 1940s. At this point in time, they were running long in the tooth, but they were still able to do just about everything that the SW8s and the SW9s were. So here we have an EMD NW2 in Manchester Yard. You just see the roof of the yard office tower behind the locomotive cab. That was a wooden two-story structure in Manchester Yard where the freight agents and the clerks would do their business. It's also where the yardmaster, Arthur Lynch, would do his work. He was a figurehead in Manchester, the Boston and Maine Railroad for many, many years. And once his position was abolished, once he retired, his position was abolished, and that's when the yardmasters in Manchester were no longer needed. So that would have been the late 1970s, early 1980s. Now we see an EMD SW1 out at the Agway plant, the Blue Seal Agway plant at Taylor Street in East Manchester, right around the corner from Elliott Hospital. So this is on the Portsmouth branch, which ran eastward out of Manchester. This specifically is October 24th, 1979, EMD SW1 number 1121, switching out the Agway elevator. Now this was a very busy customer for the B&M. They received both loose feed and hopper cars, which you can see here. They also received box cars of bagged feed to sell at their plant, at their outlet location. This was served right up until the late 1980s. This is 1975 here, but the Agway elevator was still receiving freight cars until about 1988 is when that customer went out. It was one of the two last customers in East Manchester. The other one was International Paper at Valley Street. So there was a multitude of industrial customers in East Manchester, which would have been served by a switcher crew here out of Manchester Yard. And just westward from that location, we see an EMD SW8, number 806. This is a Richard Anderson photo from 1966. They're going to run around their train at the runaround track, which was located between Valley Street, Belmont Street, and Taylor Street. So they're going to run around their train, head back to Manchester Yard. So this is a freight switcher crew out of Manchester Yard doing their work on the Portsmouth branch in East Manchester. Now we'll head to another spot. This is Terrytown, approaching Terrytown Road in East Manchester. Elliott Hospital is just out of sight up the hill to the right. This is the local freight heading out on the branch with an Alco RS3. This is freight C10 out of Concord, approaching Terrytown Road in East Manchester. There was a wigwag signal at Terrytown Road, which was pretty common in the Manchester area. There were a few of those type of crossing signals on the various branches, the Manchester and Lawrence and the Portsmouth branch specifically. So this is the local freight, which they're going to run out to Portsmouth, turn, and come back to Concord. Another shot, you can see the wigwag there. This is at Terrytown Road. This is 1974. This is an EMD GP7 leading the local freight Y4 heading out towards Epping, New Hampshire. So by 1974, the Portsmouth branch was no longer being used as a through route to Portsmouth, New Hampshire. So local freights usually only terminated in Epping, New Hampshire. They would run out to Epping where there was a large congregation of customers, do their work at Epping, and then head back to Concord. So it was very unusual for trains to pass beyond Epping in the mid to late 1970s. Speaking of which, we are here in the late 1970s. This is October 1979. This is a B&M local freight behind, I'm sorry, not October, this is June 1979, with a local freight behind B&M 1702, that's an EMD GP9, approaching Route 21 in Auburn, New Hampshire. So they've just passed by Lake Massabesic. They're going to run through Auburn and then through Candia and Raymond before arriving at Epping, which is where they're going to do their work. They have two boxcars on the train at this point in time. They've got a 50-foot boxcar for the Brick Company, which was located just east of Route 125 in Epping. And they've got a 40-foot boxcar, B&M steel boxcar for the Merrimack Farmers Exchange outlet in Epping, which was a very important customer for the Boston and Maine. So those two customers in Epping were receiving freight this late in the game in 1979. Back in Manchester here, you can see part of that Agway elevator. This is just off of Taylor Street with Belmont Street in the background. You can just see the Agway elevator and a hopper car loose feed to the right. This is EMD SW8, number 800, which is going to do its work at the runaround. They're probably going to switch out Agway first and then head back to Manchester Yard. This is a Lewis Bodwin photo. This and the previous shot, Lewis Bodwin photos. Now we're here in East Manchester. This is January 8th, 1977. So B&M 1567 and snowplow W3736 are clearing the Portsmouth branch from Manchester Yard to Page Street. Once they get to Page Street, they're going to reverse direction and back into Manchester Yard. So they're only clearing the branch as far as Page Street so that the switcher crews can serve all the industrial customers in East Manchester. They probably ran a plow train on the Portsmouth branch later on when they needed to, but since that trackage wasn't being utilized as frequently east of Page Street towards Epping, they probably weren't going to run that far on this day. And here they are backing to Manchester Yard. This is in the vicinity of Lincoln and Silver Street in Manchester, East Manchester. That's that GP7 and the plow backing. 1977 and 78, as you probably know, were very landmark years for snowfall. So they had a lot of plow trains running on the Boston and Maine during those 2 years. I believe we saw this photo already, so we're going to skip over this one and head to the next one. We're going to run back down the M&L branch to Derry, New Hampshire. So by 1980, the Manchester and Lawrence branch was getting pretty decrepit. The Boston and Main declared bankruptcy in 1970, so in the years following, maintenance was not a huge priority. They couldn't necessarily afford to maintain the trackage, especially on rural branch lines where there were only a handful of customers receiving freight cars. Most of the maintenance was reserved for main lines, where they would have a more higher volume of traffic. So the Manchester and Lawrence branch suffered pretty heavily in terms of maintenance. The local freight was still coming up from Lawrence and running as far as Londonderry, which was the limit for the local at that point in time. But derailments were common, and they've derailed here on May 21st, 1979. This is LA1, the Lawrence-based local. They've derailed just off of North High Street in Derry, New Hampshire. One car derailed, one car on the ground. They have two cars and a caboose on this day with a GP9 leading. Getting a better look, it's actually GP7, number 1574. But you can see one of the derailed cars here and the caboose just off of North High Street in Derry. There was an overpass just out of sight ahead of the train, which is gone now. It's been filled in. This section has not been developed as a trail yet. I understand eventually they're going to plan on extending the Manchester and Lawrence branch trail out of Derry towards Manchester Airport. But at this point in time, the local freight was still coming up from Lawrence. Now, in 1980, there were a series of very serious derailments on the Manchester and Lawrence branch, and the Boston and Main decided that it would have made more sense to send a local freight out of Manchester to run to Derry and serve the customers in Derry than it did to send a local freight all the way to Londonderry from Lawrence. So they took a section of track out of service in Windham, New Hampshire, which effectively cut the branch into two portions. So the branch was then served by a Lawrence local from Lawrence to North Salem and by a Concord-based local from Manchester down into Derry, where there were still a few customers. But derailments were still common, and one of the most famous derailments on the branch occurred in early 1982. This is January 6, 1982. CO1, so that's the Concord-based local, has derailed here with GP7 number 1555 in Derry. It actually derailed the day before, in January 5th, and they're just righting the engine. So this engine actually went on its side. That's how serious this derailment was. Severely damaged the front of the locomotive to the point where they had to replace one of the number boards on the left-hand side of the locomotive. And after this, the B&M really started to take a look at the operations on the Manchester and Lawrence branch and decide it just wasn't worth it. So no trains ran on the Manchester and Lawrence branch until early summer 1982, when they ran one local freight to Derry to pick up the cars that were left in Derry and then back out, and that was it. And after that, no trains ran from Manchester Airport to Derry. Now, the local freight still came up from Lawrence to Salem, and a switcher still ran as far as Manchester Airport to serve the customers at Manchester Airport until about 1989. But from 1983 onwards, there were no trains in Derry, New Hampshire. Head back to Manchester Yard for a moment here. We're looking towards the engine facility track. That's GP9, number 1715. It's got bicentennial stripes on the nose. So this is actually a few years after the bicentennial, but the stripes are still there on the front to commemorate that occasion. You can see an EMD-SW1 to the left with a switcher job, and you can see part of that brick roundhouse remnant that's still there at this point in time. This photo specifically was taken May 29th, 1979 by Louis Baudouin. And one of the occasions that's often mentioned in Manchester and the surrounding areas in terms of railroad history, the brief trials in which the MBTA ran passenger trains up to Concord, New Hampshire. So preliminary runs to test the trackage were taken in 1979, with the trial officially starting in 1980 and running until early 1981. So this is May 11th, 1980. We're looking north here, just beyond the Queen City Bridge overpass there. In Manchester, we have a southbound MBTA passenger train with an F40, number 1003, and some Pullman standard passenger cars heading towards Lowell and then eventually Boston. Now, if you look here, you can see in the distance Manchester Yard, the Woods Yard, is packed with freight cars on the left. On the right was Granite State Packing, which is now occupied by the Elliott at River's Edge location. But that was a pretty important customer for the Boston and Main. And then if you look just beyond the signal tower there, there's a siding that curves off to the right. That was the siding for the old McAllen Shoe Factory, which was Foster Grant at this point in time. Now, as the decade went on in the 1980s, Manchester became less and less of an important railroad destination. The Goffstown branch was the first to go in 1981, along with the West Side Spur, which was connected to that Goffstown branch. And the Boston and Maine started to look around at its operations. And some of the rural branch lines in the area, the Portsmouth branch specifically, and the Manchester and Lawrence branch, just were not generating enough money. There were constant derailments. There were not enough customers. So the B&M decided that it was about time to abandon those branches. So they started to abandon those branches in sections. Manchester itself still had a number of industrial customers, both on the south side, along the Manchester and Lawrence branch to the airport, and along the Portsmouth branch to East Manchester. But there was not a lot of hope looking towards the future, towards that industrial base. Guildford Rail System purchased the Boston and Maine in 1983. Guildford's outlook was based more towards long distance and unit train capacity than it was towards serving small customers. And this was a trend that was not only seen there, but around the country as well. The focus, railroading-wise, was starting to trend away from small customers towards larger customers that could be served in a unit capacity. And Manchester, unfortunately, didn't have a lot of that. They had a lot of small customers. So throughout the decade, it started to decline. The yard was shrunk. Many tracks were removed. A lot of the customers started to move away from railroading. They moved towards trucking. Guildford established a few different surcharges, so extra charges on top of freight charges, which would be charged to the industrial customers. So that pushed some of them towards trucking away from the railroad. So by mid-decade, by the 1980s, Manchester was losing its industrial customers at a very rapid pace. They were dropping like flies. They were still running down the Manchester and Lawrence branch to Manchester Airport, and the previous slide we saw was actually taken at Beach Street on the Manchester and Lawrence branch of a local freight coming back from Manchester Airport. And this current slide we're looking at here is Manchester Yard. That's the Manchester Switcher, Guildford GP 39-2. 1985 saw another landmark change in Manchester. The Boston and Maine decided that, Guildford at this point in time, running the Boston and Maine, decided that the Northern Main Line north of Concord, or north of Manchester to Concord rather, was not necessarily gaining them a lot of revenue. The Northern Main Line from Concord to White River Junction had already been mostly abandoned at that point in time, and not formally abandoned, but through train traffic had been abandoned. So the New England Southern Railroad, which was a short line railroad operating on the White Mountain branch out of Concord towards Lincoln, New Hampshire, approached the Boston and Maine in 1983, offering to take over switching rights in Concord. They would like to have that industry because they figured that that would give them a boost in their economy, in their business base. And the Boston and Maine took a look and said, well, we're not generating a lot of revenue switching Concord, so we'll give you switching rights in Concord, but while we're at it, we're going to give you the main line south to Manchester because we're not gaining a lot of revenue out of that. We think you could probably do a better job gaining that revenue from that. So in 1985, the agreement was formalized where the short line New England Southern was given trackage rights over the main line to Manchester as an interchange point. So all the customers north of Manchester went to New England Southern. They would run from Concord to Manchester and do their interchange work in Manchester. The companies and the industries in Manchester were still the domain of Guildford. All the branches were still Guildford, but that was where the New England Southern did their interchange work in Manchester Yard. Another shot, these two shots were taken by Barry Sannell, who was a railroad enthusiast in Manchester. There's actually a section in the book Queen City Rails narrated by Barry talking about an experience he had riding one of the Manchester switchers in the late 1970s. But he was still shooting here. This is the late 1980s, and here is the New England Southern freight behind GP7 number 302 arriving in Manchester Yard with some freight from Concord. New England Southern still operates today. They run the state-owned White Mountain branch northbound out of Concord, New Hampshire. In 2010, 2011, Guildford, which at that point in time was running as Pan Am Railways, retook the main line into Concord. So New England Southern no longer runs that territory. Another shot, this is taken in 1986, June 1986, by H. Bentley Crouch. This is from the Beverly Historical Society's Walker Transportation Collection of 302 and the freight arriving in Manchester Yard. And a really nice, not nice, but detailed look at the status of Manchester Yard at this point in time. weed grown, rusted, overgrown. A lot of the tracks sitting unused. A lot of the industrial customers, as we said, had moved away from rail service. The branch lines were starting to be abandoned. The Manchester switcher was only operating the Portsmouth branch occasionally to Page Street, where there were still a few customers, and they were still running to Manchester Airport, which is where New Hampshire Plastics was still a customer. But other than the branches in Manchester, there were not a lot of freight customers left in Manchester, so there wasn't a lot of need for a full freight yard. So Guildford started to slowly remove those facilities as the 1980s wore on. Really nice shot looking at the rear end of 503, which is a GP18 owned by New England Southern. Here in Manchester Yard, they've arrived in Manchester to do their interchange work, drop off freight from Concord and points north, and interchange that with new freight coming up from Guildford, from Nashua. You can see some of the landmarks of Manchester Yard in the background, the Firestone sign, which was a landmark of the area for quite a while, there off to the right. So neat shot. This is circa 1989 of New England Southern in Manchester Yard. Now we'll close out the presentation. We're looking here, we're back a few years earlier, better years, arguably when the Boston and Maine was still serving a thriving customer base in Manchester. There were still road freights running through town. There was still local freights running out on the branches, and switchers running all hours of the day and the night out on the industrial customers in Manchester. This is Barry Sandal photo. The next few photos were taken by Barry from that day where he was riding a switcher in Manchester Yard in late 1977. This is the local power in Manchester Yard, 2 GP9s and the caboose running the local south out of Manchester. They're going to head down to probably the Woods Yard and the Ledges Yard, make up their train, and then get the heck out of town and head south with some freight. When we watch the engines pass by us, that's Stuart Adair, who was an engineer in the foreground. He was a switcher engineer in Manchester, and he was the one that Barry rode around with that day on the switcher. You can see the crew in the cab of the Jeep. We had a brief technical pause there, but you can see the crew in the cab of the GP9 waving as they pass by Barry and Studi. That was his nickname, Stuart Adair, as they pass southbound through Manchester Yard. And the two Jeeps, one cleaner than the other, as they pass heading down towards the yards in Manchester to make up their train of freight and head south on the New Hampshire route Mainline. Away from the brakeman there on the rear of the caboose, and you can just start to see some of Manchester Yard appear in the shots here. The next shot will show it a little bit more clearly. We'll talk about the different parts of the yard there once we see it. And there you can see to the left, that's the Ledges Yard, and to the right, just out of sight on the right would have been the Woods Yard. So the two freight yards in Manchester, 2 GP9s heading off into the sunset with a caboose, classic image of Boston and Maine service there in Manchester, New Hampshire. And just the image you would have seen in Manchester. It was one of the busiest locations, and that was our purpose in getting Queen City Rails out to you and in this presentation to kind of illustrate what happened to the Boston, Maine, and some of these industrial locations in Manchester and other places, and tell the story that happened as rail industry in New England started to go by the wayside, but to show these images from those better days that kind of tell that story. So now we'll take any questions. If anybody had any specific questions about the presentation, about Manchester specifically or any of the branches, we have your comments here live. So if you have any specific questions, go ahead and post them below. We'd love to take them. We do have some society news to share with you afterwards. So stick around for that. We have some good news here for you. But before then, if anybody has some questions, feel free to post them below and we'll take them right now. Well, it looks like we did a pretty good job of explaining things. If any more questions come through, in the meantime, we'll answer them. But we do have some news for you. So you may have been paying attention to our Facebook page and our posts. We had to shut down merchandise sales briefly, and most of our merchandise sales are still shut down. However, we do have a limited merchandise capacity now. We are able to ship out certain items. So we are offering Queen City Rails, which of course is the book this presentation was based on. And it has quite a few more photos in it that were not in the presentation. So all the photos you saw today did not make it into the book. So there's about 125 pages in this book of mostly color photographs in and around Manchester on those 3 branch lines that you did not see today. So if you're interested in getting more into the story of Manchester, into the story of those branches, we'd love you to pick up this book. It's fantastic.
And he'll sign it.
And if you'd like, I'll sign it for you. And you can add that to your library if you're interested. We also have for sale on a limited capacity our newest DVD, which is the films of Robert Chafin, which is some fantastic color film from the 1950s between 1939 and 1956. Just to kind of read you off some of the content of this DVD. We've got steam to diesel transition footage. We have footage of commuter trains in and out of North Station. The Hoosick Tunnel electrics operating in color. There's also some shots taken in New Jersey and Pennsylvania. Some rare color images of Maine's Bridgeton and Harrison Narrow Gauge Railroad. Vermont's Montpelier and Wells River, and the busy White River Junction Yard and Crossroads. So a very comprehensive DVD. This is on sale at our website. We can ship this out. So if you're interested in picking that up, you can head on to our website. We also have for sale an updated disc of the B&M Bulletin through our most recent editions. So if you're running out of reading material at home, if you want to catch up on the B&M Bulletin, this is every issue from 1971 to 2019, the most recent edition of the B&M Bulletin. They're in high-quality PDFs, so you can read through them. I believe they are searchable PDFs as well. So if you'd like to pick that up, we also offer that on our website. And of course, as always, everything we have for sale on the website goes to support the B&M Historical Society, goes to support these presentations and keeping us operating since we can't go to train shows and meet in person at this point in time. So I did see some questions appear while we were talking about the merchandise, so we'll go through them. Andy Byron asks, when was the coal train wreck in the 1980s? Now that's actually an interesting question. There were quite a few. The track conditions on the New Hampshire main line were not doing so hot in the 1980s. They were better than the branch lines, but it was still the victim of deferred maintenance as the result of the 1970 bankruptcy. So there were coal train derailments in the 1970s and 1980s. There was one specifically in North Manchester near Amoskeag. There was one near the Eve Street, Chauncey Street area in North Manchester. There was one further up, I believe, in the area of the Hooksett Passing siding right across the river from the Route 3 truck stop area, which is just south of Hooksett Village. And there was one at Roby's Store, just north of Roby's Store in Hooksett Village. So quite a few coal train derailments there. Of course, the Bow coal trains were an important operation for the Boston, Maine, and Guildford, still running today in a limited capacity. I had a question from Ron Wood, who took some of the photos you saw today. The shot of the Guildford GP9 crossing Beach Street coming back from Manchester Airport with hoppers from New Hampshire Plastics. Ron shot a lot of photos in the Manchester area in the 80s. Ron asks, did the West Side Spur last after the end of service to Goffstown? The answer to that is no, and the reason is because the only access to the West Side Spur came off of the Goffstown branch. And the Goffstown branch, of course, left Manchester Yard, crossed the Merrimack River, and then continued on to Goffstown. The switch for the West Side Spur was just west of the end of that bridge, and it curved down along 293. So once the Goffstown branch was abandoned, so was the access to the West Side Spur. And the West Side Spur was last operated a few months before September 1980, which is when the last train on the Goffstown branch operated. A couple more comments here. Was the Ledges Yard stub-ended or pulled through? Both yards in Manchester were pulled through. So the Woods Yard on the western side of Manchester was a pull-through yard, and the Ledges Yard on the eastern side of Manchester Yard was also a pull-through yard. So neither yards were stub-ended. Now the yard that existed before those yards was the Hill Yard, and the Hill Yard was located in the parking lot area of Market Basket today. That was a stub-ended yard. So the tracks in that yard were stub-ended. That was abandoned in the 1950s, late 50s, when the B&M constructed the Ledges Yard. So that was a stub-ended yard, but in our period of interest, 1965 to 1990, the hill yard was no longer in operation. There was a spur that ran through that parking lot to serve some of those mill industry buildings just north of that Market Basket location. And that survived into the late 70s, early 80s. You could still see some of the track running through those mill buildings right north of Market Basket. So to answer your question about the yards, those 2 yards will pull through. That looks about it for the questions. Obviously, if anybody has any more questions, you can comment them on the link or the video itself, and we'll try to get to them after the presentation is over in the next few days. But we hope you've enjoyed these presentations. We think it's a really fantastic way to connect with the railroad community at large and our membership. If you'd like to become a member, we would love to have you join the society. You can do that on our website. As a member, you have access to become a volunteer in one of our committees. We have 3 committees that we operate on a regular basis, and another committee which we operate as well. We have the online committee, which is new. That is the committee that puts together Minuteman Tales, that puts together these presentations. So if you want to become a part of that and help us produce these videos, you can join as a member. If you want to join our archives committee, if your thing is dealing with paperwork, scanning, organization, documents, you can join us and join the archives committee. We also have a hardware committee, which deals in donations of hardware. So station signs, semaphore blades, lanterns. If that's your thing, you can join us as a member of the society and join the hardware committee. We also have the 410 committee, which is responsible for the cosmetic upkeep of our steam locomotive switcher that we maintain in downtown Lowell, Massachusetts. Jim Nixis is the chairman for that. So if you want to help him keep that engine looking spiffy, keep that piece of B&M history preserved, you can join as a member and join Jim preserving that steam locomotive. So those are just a few things that you can benefit from becoming a member of the society. Obviously, you also receive the B&M Bulletin and the newsletter when they come out and are published. So if you want to do that, head over to our website and join us. Of course, donations are also accepted. And if you'd like to become an owner of some of that merchandise we remembered, that you can head over to our website and check that out as well. And that's going to do it for today. We're going to be doing more presentations next week, and in the ensuing weeks, we have some shot already that we'll release to you that you can check out, some diesel presentations.
Maybe we'll do
a nice shot on North Shore Freight. So we have some more coming out for you here in the ensuing weeks. But in the meantime, we really appreciate you tuning into these presentations and showing interest in the society and our work. We appreciate you watching this today. Hope you stay safe and have a great afternoon.